I gave my parents exactly what they always wanted, and that was the revenge. And I need you to understand that before I tell you the rest. Because when people hear this story, they expect a fight. And there was no fight. There was just a woman who spent 23 years watching her parents choose everything over her, and then one day decided to choose herself so completely. And so finally, that her parents got to spend the rest of their lives with the absence they had been practicing for decades. And the last time my mother called me, she said, "Margaret, we just want to be close to you again." And I said, "I know, Mom," and I said, "You have my number." And I hung up and I felt nothing that required an apology and everything that felt like fresh air, and the birthday they forgot was not the beginning. It was just the moment I finally understood that being forgotten was not an accident. It was a pattern, and patterns do not change by themselves. They change when the person absorbing them decides to stop. Hey there, welcome back. And honestly, if you're new here today of all days, I'm really glad you found this one, because this story sat inside me for a long time before I knew how to tell it without flinching. My name is Margaret Collier, and I am 34 years old, and I turned 11 years old at a police station, and a woman named Officer Tessa Chen bought me a cupcake from the vending machine and sang happy birthday quietly so the other officers wouldn't hear, and that cupcake is the most vivid memory of my 11th birthday. And my parents were in Portugal, and they had forgotten I existed for 4 days. And the school had called them and gotten voicemail, and called my aunt, who was supposed to be checking on me, and my aunt had misread the calendar and thought she was coming. Thursday, not Tuesday, and by Wednesday evening I had eaten the last of the cereal and walked to the neighbor's house, and the neighbor had called the non-emergency police line because she was 81 and didn't know what else to do, and that is how I ended up at a police station on my birthday, eating a vending machine cupcake while Officer Chen filled out paperwork, and my parents were photographing architecture in Lisbon. My parents were not monsters. And I want to say that clearly because the story is more complicated than monsters and more honest than that. And what my parents were was people who had built their entire identity around a version of themselves that did not have much room for a child. And my father was a travel writer, and my mother was a photographer, and they were genuinely talented and genuinely passionate and genuinely in love with each other and with the world and with the life they had constructed, and I was a part of that life the way a houseplant is part of a room, which is to say I was there. And I was occasionally tended to, and I was never really the point. And I understood this earlier than any child should understand anything. And I adjusted the way children adjust, which is quietly and completely, and in ways that do not show up until much later. The Portugal trip was not the only time, and I think that is important. Because one forgotten birthday could be a mistake, and a pattern is something else entirely. And the pattern looked like this. My parents left for assignments and left me with whoever was available, and available was a rotating cast of aunts and neighbors, and one semester a graduate student who rented our spare room, and my parents called when they remembered and sent postcards that arrived after they did and came home, with gifts that were clearly purchased in airports, and told me about the places they had been with the specific enthusiasm of people who had not thought about me once while they were there. And I listened, and I nodded, and I put the airport gifts on my shelf. And I learned to make my own birthday cakes by the time I was 12. And I learned to sign my own permission slips by 13. And I learned to be the kind of person who does not need much from anyone, because needing things from my parents had a very poor return rate. And by the time I left for university at 18, I had become so self-sufficient that my mother said to my father at the airport, "I think she's going to be just fine." And my father said she's always been independent. And they said it proudly, and I heard it as the last confirmation of something I had already understood, which was that my competence had always been more convenient for them than my need. What my parents wanted more than anything was legacy. And I knew this because they talked about it the way some people talk about money, which is constantly and with a specific hunger. And my father wanted his travel writing to be taught in journalism programs, and my mother wanted her photography in permanent collections. And they wanted to be the kind of people whose work outlasted them. And they said this openly, and they said it at dinner tables, and they said it in the acknowledgments of books. And they said it to me specifically on the occasions when they remembered I was a person who could listen, and what I understood from all of that wanting was that legacy was the dream, and the dream was the thing, and everything else, including me, was the everything else. After university, I became a literary agent, and I was good at it quickly because I had grown up watching my father construct narratives, and I understood story architecture in my bones. And within 4 years, I had a small but serious client list. And within 7 years, I had built a reputation in the industry that had nothing to do with my parents and everything to do with 11 years of doing the work. And then my father called me and said, "Margaret, I've been working on something new." And I said, "Tell me about it." And he described a memoir about 30 years of travel writing and the places and the people and the life. And I listened and I said, "Dad, that sounds like the book you were always meant to write." And he said, "Do you think it's publishable?" And I said, "I think it could be significant." And he said, "Would you consider representing it?" And I paused for exactly 1 second and I said, "Yes." I want to tell you what I was thinking in that second, because it matters. And what I was thinking was that my father had just handed me the dream, and the dream was the gift. And the gift was going to be the thing that showed him everything he had not seen. And I was not going to sabotage the book. I was going to do my job with complete professionalism and get it the best possible outcome. And that outcome was going to require my father to sit with every editor and every interviewer and every reader and answer questions about the life he had lived and the family he had built, and the cost of choosing the world over the people who needed him at home. And I knew this because I knew the book, and I knew what honest memoir requires, and I knew my father well enough to know that he was going to tell the truth. Because he was a writer, and writers who tell the truth about the world eventually have to tell the truth about themselves. I sold the book in 8 months to a serious publisher, and my father was thrilled, and my mother called me and said, "Margaret, this is because of you." And I said, "I just did my job," and the editorial process began. And his editor was a woman named Patricia, who was thorough and precise and who asked my father to go deeper on the family chapters. And my father called me after the 3rd editorial session and said, "Patricia keeps asking about you." And I said, "What does she ask?" And he said about what it was like for you when we traveled, and I said, "What do you tell her?" And he said the truth, and I said, "Good." And he said, "Margaret, some of this is difficult to write." And I said, "I know, Dad." And he said, "I didn't realize how it looked from the outside." And I said, "I know." And he said, "The Portugal trip is in there." And I said, "I thought it would be." And he went quiet. And then he said, "I'm sorry." And that was the first time in 34 years my father had said those 2 words to me in that order, about anything. And I said, "I know, Dad." And I said, "Finish the book." And he did. The book came out 14 months later, and it was genuinely good, and it was reviewed seriously, and it was also unflinching about the costs of a life built on motion. And there were passages about a daughter who learned to be alone so young that solitude became her first language, and reviewers called those passages the emotional core of the book. And my father did interviews where journalists asked about his daughter, and my father answered honestly and publicly and with a remorse that was real and visible. And my mother called me after one particular profile ran and said, "People keep asking us about you." And I said, "I know." And she said, "It's uncomfortable." And I said, "I imagine it is." And she said, "We were not bad parents, Margaret." And I said, "Mom, you left me at a police station on my birthday." And she said, "We didn't know." And I said, "That's the whole point." And the line went quiet, and I let it stay quiet, because some silences say more than the conversation that surrounds them. And my parents got their legacy, and their work is taught and collected and discussed, and every discussion includes the part about what it cost. And I gave them exactly what they wanted, and the wanting turned out to have fine print. They had never read, and the fine print was that truth is part of the package. And you do not get to choose which truths come with the legacy, and the irony that I am the agent who got them, there is not lost on me, and it is not lost on them either. And on my 34th birthday, I made my own cake the way I have every year since I was 12. And I sat at my own table and I ate it alone. And I thought about Officer Chen and her quiet singing. And I thought about how self-sufficient I had become. And I thought, for the first time in a long time, that self-sufficient is not the same as fine. And then I picked up the phone and I called a friend and I said, come over, and she did, and we